Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Utah State Capitol as we celebrate and recognize National Human Trafficking Awareness Month here in the great state of Utah. We have some of the greatest partners and collaborators, local, state, federal, community here that's made Utah really, in many ways, the tip of the spear in the global fight against human trafficking. And of course, I don't say that in any way to diminish the efforts of lots of partners around the world, but Utah has prioritized this, and I want to commend and congratulate all of you for being here. This is the type of support and education that we need to wake up the world. I will introduce everybody in just a moment. My name is Attorney General Sean Reyes. Just completed my 5th year of being in office. It's a great privilege to represent the people of Utah and to protect the people of Utah. Human trafficking is a threat that far too many people are unaware of. Dan Strong, who sits to my left, is one of our senior prosecutors against human trafficking in the AG's office. He and I just returned from a conference where we trained about 20 offices, AG offices, senior personnel and prosecutors in the fight on human trafficking. And then over 30 countries around the globe sent their top prosecutors, ministers of justice to talk about and collaborate. And one thing that I realized, those of you who are in this field know that human trafficking, modern day slavery, has never been greater in number than it is today, currently, as we sit here. But what I also realized, and Dan can corroborate this, is that more than ever, we have new and emerging assets in the fight, new technologies, new techniques, new partnerships that give me a lot of hope and I think are significant. I also recognize, as I said before, notwithstanding all of this progress that we're making, we need to work collectively to wake people up to this global threat of human trafficking. If planes were falling out of the sky and people were dying in the numbers that we see for victims of human trafficking, there would be an outcry internationally. If we looked at the health impact alone, and we just got some new numbers from research done by Laura Lederer from Global Centurion, a pioneer in the fight. She's been in this fight since the late 70s, early 80s, so it goes back a ways, and she gave us some statistics on the health impact in terms of the billions of dollars, and then of course the mental, psychological, emotional impact. Far too few people know about that, and if they did know about that, there'd be a hue and a cry, and that's where you all come in. Thank you for coming. This is Human Trafficking 101, so we're not going to assume that you know everything about trafficking. Some of the people here on this panel know about it intimately. In fact, we talk about it and think about it so much. I've had some people complain that I talk about it too much in the state. My wife has said, honey, we don't get invited to any social events ever anymore because all you do is talk about really cheery things like human trafficking, death by suicide, and opioids. And you used to be kind of fun, and people liked us, and now they still like her, and she gets invited to things, but it's worth it. And I want to commit on behalf of my team, we're never going to stop talking about this issue. So we're going to do it certainly now during the National Awareness Month, but stay tuned. We're going to keep talking, and I hope you take my challenge to keep talking about it also. So without further ado, my job is to set the stage for you to get to know better some of our amazing panelists that we have gathered here today. At my far right, to your far left, Josh Kalis is the Supervisory Special Agent for our Secure Strike Force at the Utah Attorney General's Office. It is the legislatively mandated structure by which we help coordinate all law enforcement functions. So we couldn't do it without our law enforcement partners, but Josh is a leader in this fight, has worked on and investigated a number of human trafficking cases, and is working on some right now. So again, I'll reiterate, please, if you take a picture, even by accident of him, either erase it or keep it for your own personal collection. It's kind of creepy, I know, but we can't have him exposed out there right now, and he was kind enough to agree, and I got permission from our own team to put him up because I think he has some insights that will be beneficial for you. Next to Josh is Dr. Kathy Frenchick-Roa, who is an assistant professor of pediatrics at the University of Utah School of Medicine and can speak to some of what I was alluding to, the terrible impact on victims and survivors once they're liberated, on the lifelong struggle that they have. And so we're so glad to have her with us. This is not just a law enforcement issue. This is a public health crisis. It's a mental behavioral health crisis. To my left, as I previously introduced, Dan Strong is one of our superstar prosecutors. He's the one that people call from around the country saying, Dan, how do you put together this case? How do you do that? Help us with this. And I would dare say around the world. I gave his number out, and now he's going to have 30 more countries calling him. Tremendous caring prosecution, helped us change our paradigm and making it more victim-centric from the beginning as we put these cases together. And I might add this, having our law enforcement team working with our investigators, working with our prosecutors from the very beginning of cases that we put together is a very powerful dynamic. We can talk about that some other time later on. Next to Dan, Miss Andrea Sherman. So Andrea is the Trafficking in Persons Director from the Refugee and Immigrant Center, or Asian Association, who are our joint grant participants from the Department of Justice and doing amazing aftercare work for our survivors. So we can liberate them, but really our partners help put them back on a path to reclaim their lives and have some future success. If not for them, the likelihood is that many of them will return back to the life or will take their lives or will not have the resources that they need to be able to flourish. And we want to have thrivers, not just survivors, right, Andrea? Last on the end, not last in importance, but last in chronology here, is a human trafficking survivor herself, Susie Skirvin, who you couldn't tell from just that beaming smile on the end, but suffered horribly at the hands of traffickers. And it's people like Susie that inspire me, heroes like that make me wake up excited in the morning to go out and to keep fighting on this issue, because she's able to somehow, I don't know exactly how, channel her pain and be able to use that to lift other people up constantly. So thank you, Susie, for being here. Andrea, it's an honor to have you here. Dan and Dr. Frenchick, awesome. And since you're like almost invisible, Kalis, it's good to have you as well. I don't know the order, if we do it by seating. Is there somebody who has time pressure that's going to have to leave us early that needs to go first? If not, Rick, is there a particular order? Does somebody want to lead off and maybe frame the issue? It's 101, so I'm assuming that some people here might know a little bit about it, but some may be brand new to the issue, and maybe some of the statistics, the frightening ones, that there are 40 to 50 million modern-day slaves, or this is the fastest-growing criminal enterprise, or second most lucrative. Some of those might be helpful. Dan?
Oh, sure. You want to kick it to me?
I didn't see anybody jumping up, so maybe you can give us kind of a global.
I'll probably bring you in, Andrea. I see you've got some notes here that'll be helpful. But sure. So human trafficking. I think Sean and a lot of other leaders in this area have actually done a very good job, kind of getting people to recognize the scale of this problem. That most people now that I talk to, and I go to a lot of things like this, agree and believe that human trafficking is out there, that it's even in their own communities. And that was not true 10 years ago, before I got into this type of work. That was, people would say, oh, it doesn't happen here. And so I actually think we've done a pretty good job on that message. Yeah, it's a horrible crime. It happens a lot. As Sean was saying, it's lucrative. You can only sell a drug once, but if you're trafficking in people, you can sell them again and again and again. And as we've started to crack down on some other crimes, it seems, anecdotally anyway, that more criminals out there are turning to this because they realize there's profit in it, and frankly, it hasn't been, in the past, terribly well prioritized by law enforcement. We haven't understood it very well, and so we've been helping to lead the effort to do better at that. But there's really a second part of this that I think is kind of where we are now in the public discussion, and that is that it's out there, but it's also not necessarily what you might be thinking of all the time. So there's a mismatch between kind of the pop culture image of human trafficking or the most sensational stories you've heard of human trafficking. I don't want to suggest that those don't happen. They certainly do. Sean's been at international missions where they rescue children from horrible abuses, and of course from news stories about people who were locked in rooms and held captive for years and literally in bondage. But the part that gets missed by most people that hopefully we can speak to today and that I think we can help educate each other on is that it doesn't always look like that. That there are ways to commit human trafficking without literally chaining someone up or putting them in a shipping container or transporting them at all. Because human trafficking is just the selling or it's controlling another person. And as you all know, if I put this question out, and sometimes I do this at training, what are some ways you might control someone without actually physically restraining them? I'm sure you can all think of some things, like someone might owe you a debt, or you might threaten violence against their family, or you might even just be a person who's known to be violent, and in that case you can just say, I know where your family lives, and that might be enough. All these ways that you can control a person become relevant in human trafficking cases, and they're not quite as easy to spot as someone being handcuffed or chained or detained. So this is what I deal with in my job the most, is when I'm presenting a case to a jury, or sometimes even when I'm talking to a police officer who's investigating a human trafficking case, they say to me, well, this doesn't really look like trafficking. She wasn't locked up, or he wasn't transported across an international border. And I have to say, well, wait, step back a minute, go read the statute. Human trafficking is compelling someone to work in sex or in labor by force, fraud, or coercion. The force, fraud, or coercion term is super broad. It can mean anything that would compel a reasonable person to do something they wouldn't otherwise do. So I'm giving you some legalese there, but the bottom line is, if they're not doing it of their own free will, but they're compelled by some mental pressure or physical pressure, that could be a human trafficking case. And then an important caveat, of course, is for children involved in the sex trade. We do not need to prove force, fraud, or coercion to show human trafficking in those cases, because, of course, children don't have the same capacity to consent to those acts as adults. So if you have someone who's selling or transporting or harboring or advertising a child for sex, that person's also a human trafficker, regardless of whether they used any force, fraud, or coercion. So that's my broad definition, but I know Andrea brought more detail.
Let me add one thing, Dan, and maybe you can elucidate it just a little bit too. That's an important paradigm shift too in how the public views trafficking cases, like you said, because a lot of times I hear, well, that's just prostitution, right? Maybe somebody is voluntarily or willingly do it, but prostitution, as we've historically known it, has been a type of trafficking for a long time, right? So, maybe, again, you deal with that all the time.
Yeah, right. So within the commercial sex trade or prostitution, of course, it's possible that somebody could be doing it voluntarily. We see, though, in most cases we investigate, that if you kind of peel back those layers and look behind the scenes, that there's a trafficker back there somewhere kind of controlling the enterprise, taking all or at least most of the money. That may not be true in every case, and sometimes at the higher ends it seems to be more voluntary, but in most street-level prostitution cases that we've seen, certainly where people advertise over the internet, if you dig deeper, you see traffickers behind the scenes. You see the sorts of force, fraud, or coercion, and it may be that in the initial decision that someone made to get into this field that maybe it was more or less voluntary. Certainly there's some psychological pressures, or they thought this person was their boyfriend, or things like that. We see that a lot. But once it starts down the path a few times, and once the money starts going all to the trafficker, then often the survivors or victims might ask, or may think this is not what I signed on for, and at that point it's generally very difficult to get out, and that's when you start to see things like threats of violence or economic coercion. So our cases sometimes can be a little bit messy in that way, and that the defense attorney might say, well, look, your victim here agreed to do this, and that might be true for the first instance, but we have to look at the whole time this person was in this line of work. Was force, fraud, or coercion used to compel them? Because it doesn't have to be sex, but any type of work that you're out there doing, you ought to be able to make the choice whether or not you want to keep doing that work. If I wanted to quit, Sean will let me quit, right? Put a little bit of pressure on me. Certainly wouldn't threaten. So, we should all have that freedom to work in the type of work.
That's no announcement.
Right? No, I don't want to quit. Point being that that is a serious crime, and even though it might not fit the kind of the most horrible image. I hear the movie Taken comes up a lot in this field, and that is like,
Not a bad film.
yeah, first pretty good. I actually haven't seen it. I should watch it because seriously, every training someone brings it up. Even if it doesn't look like that movie, this is a serious thing to take someone's agency away to the point that they no longer have a choice in what type of work they do, and often they're forced to do really terrible. I mean, commercial sex obviously is not a very glamorous field. Most people would not want to work in that field, but it's not just that. We see agricultural operations where people work 20-hour days and sleep on the floor, and they should have a choice whether to keep doing that without these psychological pressures on them. So anyway, that's my broad framework. I think we have a survivor here, and we have Andrew who works with victims a lot. I think like maybe the next piece of it that is really important is to think about, if you've kind of got that framework, then you start thinking, well, who is going to be victimized and how are they victimized? And you can see that the more vulnerabilities someone has, the more they find themselves kind of on the fringes of society or in need of something, that's where the trafficker can step in, supply that, and then start to ratchet up those psychological pressures. So it's incumbent on us to recognize the vulnerable people in our society and see how they might be manipulated by these traffickers and forced into a field. So, for example, an immigrant who doesn't have documentation or who is here on a visa that only allows them to work for one employer, that employer all of a sudden has a tremendous amount of control over that person because they have a vulnerability that most people don't have, which is the fear of being deported.
The risks of being victimized go up by orders of magnitude because of that.
Right, yeah, we're a homeless person who needs food, water, and shelter. Well, the trafficker might come in and offer them those things, but in exchange for what? And so
someone who's been previously abused. There's lots of markers, but that's good.
Right.
That great segue, and maybe we can pivot over then to Andrea, please.
Great, you had lots of good things that I could then expound on.
Okay.
What I'll probably start with is just kind of backing up and talking about. So he defined what the law sees and defines human trafficking. But one way we really understand it when we're working with victims and survivors is when we talk about an action, a means, and a purpose. So an action is what is happening to lead someone into an exploitive situation. So that's kind of where the recruitment part comes in. That's where they target vulnerabilities, and we can go into detail more on that. But the recruitment, the transportation, all of that is what leads them into the exploitation. And then something keeps them in the exploitation. So that's that means piece that we've mentioned a few times, the force, fraud, and coercion. So that's how they're being kept. And there's really no single method to how that looks. Something that we often use is an adaptation of the power and control wheel from the domestic violence world. And so it's through the Duluth model. And I happen to have a picture, so you guys can read all this from up back there, I'm sure. But just realizing that there is no single way that this looks. And I think that can sometimes be hard for people when we're trying to talk about it, is because there's not one victim profile, there's not one trafficker profile, there's not one specific type of business model that traffickers are using, there's not one specific geographic area that's targeted more. While there are some common characteristics and some vulnerabilities that put people at higher risk, there really is an individual picture, and it's important to remember that when working to identify victims and then also to serve victims once identified. The last piece is just the purpose. So the purpose of labor trafficking or sex trafficking. And an interesting study that happened not too long ago. So the National Human Trafficking Hotline, they have been in business and they receive calls from all over the country. And a few years ago, they had looked at data from a 10-year period. And it was about 32,000 cases that they analyzed. And they're really trying to get some typology of trafficking situations. To give us kind of a little bit of knowledge so we can move forward within the movement. And they identified, out of those 32,000, 25 specific areas. And so Utah, we have several of those areas that are prevalent on a national basis, but there's also some that aren't as prevalent here. But as he mentioned, we see agricultural and ranching type things, animal husbandry. We see the commercial sex work. We see a lot of things in hotels and restaurant hospitality industries. So there's different things that we see, and each of those different classifications of trafficking situations do have those individual factors. Like I said, they have their specific business model, the specific type of victim that they're seeing generally in that, the specific type of trafficker. And so and of course those are all guidelines, but really understanding that it's a very unique and complex process or a picture of a survivor of human trafficking. So I don't want us to just limit us to that picture of, someone chained up or a child in a foreign country. So there's so many different profiles that we want to be inclusive of so that we can be better at identifying the survivors and victims that are right here in our own communities. So.
Great.
Do you want to
talk more about vulnerability?
why don't we let maybe, since we're going down that way, anyway, Susie, do you want to maybe take a few minutes to introduce a little bit about your background and what you want to talk about? There'll be plenty of time for questions and answers.
All right, so as introduced before, my name's Susie Skirvin. I'm 22 years old. I'm a mother to a beautiful 20-month-old baby boy. I enjoy a good bowl of pho. And I'm a police officer, and I'm a survivor of human trafficking. So a little bit about my story, like they're all mentioning, it's different. I was a typical girl. I was actually getting ready to enlist into the Air Force. When I decided to move to California, I hopped on the dating app Tinder, and I started meeting guys and going on dates. And one guy in particular, his name was London. He was sweet to me. He talked to me the way I wanted to be spoken to. He was he was very charismatic. All the traits I was looking for in a man. I was thinking I was going into a romantic relationship with a wonderful man. But he, on the other hand, just had another envision for me. Things got serious. I decided to move in with him, and he was taking care of me already. So he said, hey, come move in with me. I'll put you through school. Things will be great. I said, okay. So I was 19 years old, naive, and just wanted to be taken care of. Things progressed. Anyways, that night I decided to move in. We went to dinner, and he said, so how do you think you're going to pay for all these things, that I'm providing for you? And I looked at him and I said, I don't know. I didn't know what he was talking about because, our agreement was that I was just going to move in and be his girlfriend and go to school. I laughed in disbelief and thought he was kidding. He stated, well, now you're going to be my bitch and your name is not Susie anymore. I will name you at a later time because I don't like your name. And I said, what? You can imagine. We were in a nice restaurant in Malibu and a room full of people, and I was like, what? And he had placed my Louis Vuitton purse around his chair, so I had my wallet in there, my keys, my phone, and so at that moment, I just didn't know what to do. I just sat there and ate my dinner without any appetite, because that was the only thing I could think of was just eating. And of course, I did try to find a way out, but he had everything in my purse. Finished up dinner in disbelief and disgust. I casually looked around with a smile and said, okay. That night after dinner, he took me to a stripper store and bought me an outfit. He said, okay, now you're going to be a stripper and an escort. And the only thing I could say was, okay. So like they were saying, I was 19 years old. I was getting ready to enlist into the Air Force, and I got swept away. And of course, there's more to the story, but that's just briefly, and I'll speak on on it more. But some of my signs and warnings that no one picked out, not my friends, not my family, not those around me, because simply they lacked an education of this topic in our society. And I really do appreciate you guys all being here for wanting to know more. But here are some of my signs and clues. I wasn't necessarily free to leave and come as I pleased. I had a pimp. I was unpaid and paid very little. I never had money, but if I needed something, he would provide. I worked excessively long hours. I mean, I worked from 5 a.m. till 12 a.m. the next morning. So I got maybe 3 hours of sleep a day. I was recruited through false promises. I was forced to meet daily quotas, or else I would be punished. I was fearful, I was anxious, I was depressed, submissive, tense, nervous, paranoid. I was always monitored. I was not in control of my money, my financial records, my bank account, my car. I was not in control of my own birth certificate, social security card, driver's license. I was not able to speak by myself in a room, so he was always there with me. I claimed of just visiting and not being able to clarify where I was or where I was living. I lacked knowledge of my whereabouts sometimes. I appeared to have lost sense of time at times as well. And I had stories that were scripted and confusing that made my family and my friends think. And I have a personal best friend here that's here with me. And I know there was times where she was talking to me on the phone and she was like, what is Susie up to? What is she doing? But I wasn't unable to travel freely. So when I did go visit my family for a couple hours in Utah, they couldn't book a flight for me, or I couldn't stay longer. But those were some of my clues that nobody picked out because they simply didn't know. And did it bug me for a long time? Of course, but I mean, I couldn't blame them. They just simply didn't know. But yeah, so those are a little bit of my clues and things nobody picked out. I don't know, I could keep going and talking about this forever. So
Thank you.
What do you guys have to say?
Thank you for sharing.
Yes.
It's amazing the suffering and your courage. Again, thank you, Susie. We'll definitely come back and open it up to the audience, who I'm sure has some questions. And I hate to do this to you, Doctor. It's always the hardest to come after the survivors, but if you would, maybe from your vantage point and your expertise, talk about a story like Susie's. You've got some wonderful insights.
Well, I appreciate being here today, and you know, Susie is exactly right. You know, healthcare is kind of the last ones to come on to this knowledge, because even just, I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago, we started a domestic violence committee at the University of Utah, so we knew how physicians and staff should approach patients who are victims of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. And, you know, it's always the young people who teach us the most, but one of our young family medicine residents, Dr. Saskia, was on our committee. And we were talking about, okay, we're going to have policy on vulnerable adult abuse, domestic violence, child maltreatment, sexual violence. And then Dr. Saskia says, well, Dr. Franchuk, we have to have something about human trafficking. Now, this was just 5 or 6 years ago, and I said, human trafficking, we don't live in Asia. So, and I've been in medicine for almost 2 decades by that time. So it's a shameful thing for me to admit. But when she said that, and she said, Dr. Franchuk, it's in Utah. And I said, well, then I got to find out what this is about. And that's how I got into contact with the ASIN Association, which then got me in contact with the UTIP task force. So I have learned so much from being involved in that, and I think we have developed a pretty, probably the best practice guidelines that we have today on, what does a human trafficking victim look like, or a patient look like, and you know what, they look like all of us. And that's always kind of the hard piece, is like, what does a domestic violence victim look like? They look like all of us. What is a sexual violence victim? So we do have our certain stereotypes and maybe some of the risk factors that are more common in these young people who are exploited and victimized, but we have to broaden that and understand how this can be happening to people and how we as healthcare can help with that. And as Attorney General Reyes had mentioned, Laura Lederer has just been a champion in this and has taught me so much because she's an attorney, but she did a paper on what are the health effects of sex trafficking victims who are survivors. And in that paper, it opened my eyes to knowing that up to 88% of the survivors of sex trafficking had actually accessed health care during their captivity and exploitation. So we are seeing these patients, and we're probably seeing them every day within a huge system like the University of Utah or Intermountain or something, and we are missing it every single day. So one of the things that we've done through the UTIP task force is we do have a medical subcommittee now that is trying to develop guidelines so that we can help all of our providers within Utah understand what should we be looking for, what should we do when we find it. And one of the things that we're kind of stressing is, yes, you have to take care of them acutely, which is their injuries or their poor health care, etc. But the other piece then becomes, how do we help them long term? Because many of these victims have rarely gone to a doctor for routine health care, and so they're behind on their immunizations, they're behind on their types of screening tests that we are supposed to do. One of the things as a pediatrician at the University of Utah, one of the things that had really impacted me the most was we know that a major risk factor is children who are in foster care, because if you're in foster care, chances are you've been abused, right? And so when you've been abused as a child, you're more likely to not take what people, when they exploit you or abuse you, as something that is wrong or that shouldn't be done, because that's been happening to you your whole life. So the vulnerabilities are so important for us to recognize. And one of the stories, it's not my story, but one of the young docs who really kind of took this to heart, and she's in Massachusetts, in Boston, but she was a young medical student, and she was, we have to go through all the rotations, so she was doing surgery, and she was in the OR with the physicians and the surgeons and everybody, and they were getting to do a surgery on a young woman. I don't remember exactly what the surgery was, but when they exposed her, they found a barcode tattooed on her inner thigh. And everybody was like, what is that? Kind of like, oh, well, that's what she wants, is a barcode on her inner thigh, And it didn't dawn on any of them, oh my gosh, that probably is not a choice. And so eventually we are starting to understand more and more. As I say, I see teens and children, but I ask every teen, what does that tattoo mean, or what exactly did you get that for, even if it's just a regular one, But we need to be attuned to these things and letting patients know we are a safe place for them to come and tell their story and to get help. So thank you for letting me participate in this, and I appreciate all of you and all that you've taught me over the years. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Franchek. And thank you for also mentioning the collaboration with the Utah Trafficking in Persons Task Force. It really is a powerful model. Interestingly, Laura Lederer has pointed out Utah as her sort of paradigm and model because of the work of UTIP and Secure and many, again, collaborative forces. It is staggering to me to see that not only is the health community seeing victims, but sometimes over and over and over again. Some of the anecdotes she had were startling, where the same young lady would go into the same facility and saw the same physicians with some pretty wild stories, and they treated them without that sort of knowledge of what could be out there. So I think I have an idea. There's airline ambassadors, truckers against trafficking. We're working with the hotels to create hotel heroes. I think there should be a group that you can help us start called Physicians for Freedom or something like that, just to help educate the
Yes.
medical community about it.
Yes.
Now, last but not least, on this end, Josh, can you talk about some of the perspectives from a law enforcement investigation standpoint, what you see out there?
Yeah, I can expound on everything that's been discussed so far and kind of give you a picture of what human traffickers look like in the state of Utah in our own community. But human traffickers here in Utah are mothers. Their mothers trafficking their own children, fathers trafficking their own children, their aunts, uncles, brothers, sisters. They're not the thing that we all think of a scary, and there are gangbangers that are, dangerous gangs and dangerous felons that are trafficking people here in Utah, but it's also people that are operating right under your nose, next door neighbors, and in the places, restaurants that you eat in, pretty much anywhere you go. We're investigating a case right now where a juvenile, like Dr. Kathy talked about, that's very vulnerable. She's a foster student and has a history of running away, just the type of person that a trafficker would prey on. I think the statistics say that runaways within the first 24 hours of running away are being sex trafficked in the United States.
Or at least approached.
Or at least approached for it. In this particular case right here in Utah, this individual was approached within 1 hour of running away on the streets of Salt Lake City and trafficked between Salt Lake City and Denver, Colorado, where she was ultimately located there. Don't want to talk too many details about the case since it's an ongoing investigation, but we've seen in the past where these individuals came into contact with law enforcement, and those law enforcement officers weren't seeing the signs or noticing that this person was a victim of trafficking, and with the trafficker at the time they were talking to law enforcement. Being in law enforcement, I can say that as a young patrol officer in Maryland, I didn't see a lot of these signs and probably wouldn't have noticed these things either without the extensive training and where I'm at right now in my career. But we've seen cases here where individuals have been stopped on traffic stops with a victim, even a child victim, and having contact with law enforcement, and they aren't asking the questions because a lot of us don't do that. Here in Utah, I've seen a trafficker trafficking young boys. A lot of times we think that trafficking is just a pretty girl that, like down at the end of the table here, that was, put into that situation and preyed upon. But here in Utah, we've seen young boys be trafficked, both sex trafficked and labor trafficked. And in that particular case, back in 2014, that our office worked on, that particular trafficker was actually going to court hearings of one of the victims that he was victimizing and pretending to be that individual's father. And these victims were all, not only were they underage juvenile males, but they were all undocumented. So all here in the country illegally from South and Central America and Mexico. And this individual preyed upon them in the community here and had such a hold over him that he would actually go to the court. One of the individuals was 15 or 16 and got arrested for drug trafficking while employed by the trafficker, and was told that you don't say anything, you meet your charges, and you're going to move through the court process, and you're a juvenile, so you're just going to get a slap on the wrist and be back here with me. And then he actually went and took steps to go to the court hearings during that case and kind of hold that thumb and hold the pressure over that child. And nobody's asking those questions because it's not a common question that you would ask. Hey, are you the father of this kid? Everyone just assumed that he was. It wasn't until later that individual disclosed that the trafficker was not his father and that his real parents lived in Honduras, and he was ultimately deported and sent back to Honduras. That's at his request. and he didn't want to help build a case at that time against that individual, and that was 4 years prior to us receiving knowledge of the case and being able to bring a good, solid case against him here in Utah.
One of the largest cases in the history of our country, right here, for going on for 15 or so years under our noses in a quiet suburb of Utah. Josh, thanks for those perspectives. You brought up, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time, I just want to point out a few things. You brought up the profile of traffickers, Johns, and victims, saying that all of them could be any of us. So very difficult, to Dan's earlier point, to spot what it looks like, because I know some of our undercover stings have, unearthed people who are very respectable on the surface. You also talked about a multitude of different types of cases. They're not just human trafficking cases, they're narco trafficking and human trafficking cases. They're labor exploitation along with other types of exploitation. And before I forget, I wanted to also just acknowledge so many NGOs that have helped us. I've already highlighted some of the work that the Asian Association's done, but organizations like Operation Underground Railroad, Fight the New Drug, Polaris, which is national but has come in and done training, International Justice Mission, so many of these other groups that have been integral in the fight, they've inspired and really helped awaken. I saw in the back with some OUR shirts and just really helped put Utah on the map. So thank you to all of our NGO partners, whether you're here or listening. Can't thank you enough for your support. Well, with those introductory sort of remarks, we really wanted to make this interactive and let you ask a survivor, ask an undercover asset or a physician questions about trafficking that maybe you had or that you are now having because of what they've talked about. So I'll open this up. My job's easy. I just get to moderate and pick. So make my job harder by multiple hands going up. That would be helpful. Don't be shy. If you don't want to be, on camera, we can make sure that we respect that and honor that, and just have the panelists answer. If you do, then we can certainly turn it around too and try to get you some camera time. Oh yes, Chris, you have a question?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Chris Newhart, Soul Central Magazine. I was just wondering, in your opinion, what is the best advice that you could give to anyone that was in your situation to avoid it or see it coming, or just the.
And you're addressing it to Susie, our survivor, Susie
Correct.
Skirvin. Awesome, Susie.
So you're asking how people can avoid it or be aware of it, red flags?
Yes.
Is that what, okay, red flags. That's tough because, I mean, as humans, we want to develop, connection and love with people around us. I'm sure everyone in this room loves being connected with people, and that's why we're so passionate about this topic. But red flags, if somebody, for me, now that I know the red flags, I should have spotted them. His stories never added up. His time frames of things that he did in his life didn't add up. He lied to me about his age. He didn't have a job, really. He didn't go to work. He just said he worked. I was like, okay. I didn't look into his social media pages. I didn't ask around. He never was around family or friends. Things like that that weren't really normal. I didn't ask about his family or his friends or his work. I didn't look up his social media pages. That's a huge, huge one. Is look into their Facebook page. Look into their social media page. What are they doing? How do they spend their time? Things like that. You have to just keep these things in mind. And another red flag was he was always wanting to buy me things all the time. It was overwhelming at one point, which I liked, but I mean, looking back, it was kind of weird. So if somebody's always wanting to buy you things and making promises right off the bat, that isn't normal. You know, somebody that's
Right.
interested in you romantically and thinks highly of you wouldn't just, you know, want to just take care of you from the beginning. So that was a pretty big step. And
I think those are really good markers. Not to diminish what you said, but a guy who doesn't have a steady job and can't keep his story straight, that describes like a whole lot of the male population out there, which just underscores your point, which is just really hard to know unless you have ESP and understand how these are master manipulators.
Yeah.
Grace. These guys know. I've worked with some of them after we've either prosecuted them or part of a negotiation for a plea. They say, look, put me on a street, and within seconds, it doesn't matter if it's the most well-adjusted, popular, self-confident young lady or young man, I can have them in my thrall. I know what buttons to push psychologically to make them beholden to me. It's scary, but those are the types of people that we're dealing
he's
with.
absolutely right.
So I didn't mean to make light of that. It just sounded
It's
funny
just-
because you're like, oh, buy me something. My wife never had that problem with me buying her too much stuff. I guess I was okay. But
It's just so hard, you know. That's why it's such an issue, because it's not black and white. And now that I'm a police officer, with it's. I think as police officers, sometimes we like to look at a situation and say, okay, is this wrong? Is this white or is this black? But with human trafficking, it's not like that. It's like, could be white, could be gray, could be black. I actually ran into a police officer in Hollywood while I was being trafficked. This is kind of a tangent story. My pimp got arrested, and so I went in, and I was supposed to bail him out, and so I was talking to him, and the police officer saw me, and he kind of sensed something was going on, but never made contact with me personally. He kind of just told his buddies, like, hey, I think something's going on over there. But they knew his age because he had been arrested. He had told me he was 26, but he was actually 46. So they were like, why is a 19-year-old girl with a 46-year-old man? Yeah. And so he didn't make contact with me. He just saw me, you know, and thought the idea in his head. He left it alone. Well, you know, months went by, and I reported it, and that's one of the ways I got out. I came in contact with him again, and he was there in the questioning room, and he said, I am so sorry I didn't come up to you and talk to you. I was actually there when you were when you had come into contact with Booker while he was in jail. I mean, how awesome would it have been for him to, you know, be nosy, ask questions. What are you doing here? Who is that guy to you? You know, we're human, and, you know, as one of my good friends mentioned, we need to be nosy. I mean, we need to be in each other's business and ask questions. Whoever you are, wherever you are, just ask questions. When I go to these calls with these kids, even if it's just a normal call, I love asking questions. I love getting to know people. Had that officer ask questions, who knows, maybe I would have gone out sooner. If not, I would have known there was hope out there for me. But yeah, that's...
Can I, two observations, Susie. One, to your question, Chris, I think a lot of times it seems victims, if they're not able to recognize it, it's incumbent on us around to be those eyes and ears, like you said, for the officer. And age discrepancy is not inherently an indicator, but it's one of many factors in the totality of circumstances that should maybe just make you think. We often tell people, if your spidey sense goes off in the community, call us as law enforcement. Well, we don't want to call you because we don't want to bother you. It might not be. Well, we would rather go through 10 cases and have all 10 of them not turn out to be human trafficking than to miss one case because somebody was I don't want to rock the boat. It can't really happen in my community. So I love what Susie said. Be nosy.
Right.
And look, I'm not saying if your neighbor is overwatering their lawn to call law enforcement and send the SWAT team in. But if you see something that just makes I can't say it anymore, your spidey sense, I think intuitively everybody knows, something goes off and says, I don't know about it. Call it, talk to somebody. The other thing is, even if that officer would have approached Susie at that time, we often see victims, while they're in it, aren't necessarily, either they're reluctant for many reasons because they're scared, or they may just not, they've been programmed, conditioned to not feel like they're victims of trafficking. They feel like they're empowered often, and they'll resist, and you can't give up. You've got to keep trying to find ways to report it to the law enforcement. So if you approach your friend and say, hey, are things okay? Yeah, everything's good. Yeah, it's really weird. I'm noticing you're not yourself. No, it's fine. I've just not been feeling good. I'm taking some medications for it. Don't just again, just leave it at that. Keep probing. Again, we owe it to each other to be a little nosy. So anybody else want to?
Yeah, I want to chime in too. So I think those are all really important things. Recognizing those red flags, being nosy. So on average, again, a report through Polaris, they found that the average age for someone to be led into a sex exploitation situation is 19, and for labor trafficking, it's 23. And so part of our job as well in Utah is that prevention work. If we can get the information to these people who could then be vulnerable to enter into a trafficking situation, then that is a huge way that we can also combat this. Our agency specifically, we have prevention groups that target some of those high-risk populations. So we do one with the Volunteers of America, with some of those homeless and runaway youth. We do another that's in a substance abuse treatment center. So things like that. But then we're also in the schools. We're in the schools. We're getting the information about what those red flags are to look for. So it's not just leaving people up to their own intuition. Exactly, it's that plus putting some of those educational tools for people to be able to recognize kind of before that situation would ever occur in their lives. And so prevention before, but then just in general education and outreach, the more people that we can talk to, and it's really specific to discipline. So with the healthcare, with law enforcement, with I'm blanking on other disciplines for some reason.
Education,
yes, education, victim services, domestic violence providers. There's all these different discipline-specific areas that we can really develop really specific referral pathways to get the report and to get into, to connect that victim to services. So all of that education and outreach piece I really think is super important too, as far as the prevention side, but also as far as the awareness and connecting them to all the available services we have in Utah.
Can we throw a shout out to Backyard Broadcast, our high school partners, who do such a good job. So if you don't know, and your kids are in high school, start a Backyard Broadcast program, and it's students running it, guiding it, educating each other. They testify here on the Hill, and what more powerful, persuasive testimony than from students who are so vulnerable to talk about it. So 100% agree with everything that Andrew says. Awesome.
The most, if I can chime in there too, the most, so you encountered a police officer who didn't, help, and that's one thing, but we also need to remember that the police, if they come at this from the wrong paradigm, can really hurt things. I mean, what if that police officer had arrested you for commercial sex or prostitution? And unfortunately, that still happens all over the place, even in Utah. The shift that needs to happen in the public consciousness is that people out there working in commercial sex many times are victims. Now, I don't want to put a hard number on it, but it's been most of the cases I've seen that we've looked into that they're victims. And the worst way to approach your victim is to arrest them and put them in jail for something, right? Especially when you know that, because we see so many of these crimes, that there's pretty likely there's somebody back there behind the scenes you should look into. At the same time, we can't legalize prostitution, so some of these cases are going to get investigated, but it needs to be done from a caring, aware way that looks for those red flags and identifies potential victims and then treats them as such. And that's one thing that the AG's office, in partnership with RCAU, and there's a federal effort on this as well that we're a part of, is really taking the lead on is it's called the victim-centered approach to these cases, and that means that there's plenty of police departments out there who their approach is, well, I'm going to arrest this person. I caught him or her in prostitution, and if they want to tell me that there's someone behind the scenes, maybe I'll let them out. That is a very low yield success rate, and additionally, it re-victimizes people and hurts them. And I'm not saying this to cast stones. I was a misdemeanor prosecutor. I prosecuted prostitution cases. I took pleas, and now I know that there were probably, traffickers in the courtroom that day, making sure that the person went in there and pled guilty, and I didn't know that. So it's on me too. But we can all do a better job educating ourselves and approaching these cases in a victim-centered way. Some things we've done in 2015, the Utah legislature passed a bill that we supported that mandatory for any child involved in commercial sex. They cannot be prosecuted for child prostitution. They have to be referred to services through DCFS. We're working to kind of expand that, and there's a bill Representative Romero's running this year that will expand that and give that even more teeth in a sense, and actually direct police specifically that not only should you refer them to services, but you should also begin an investigation into possible human trafficking. I've had a case where, so as I described it, if there's a child engaged in commercial sex, there's a trafficker, because the person who paid them is a trafficker under the law, or the person who sold them is a trafficker under the law. So anytime you have a child out there engaged in prostitution or commercial sex, you have a human trafficking case. And I've had officers come to me and say, I think this is just a kid who likes to run away and have sex. I mean, that's a direct quote from an officer I talked to, and I said, well, no, first, no one does that. No one likes that. And also, you've got traffickers here. Investigate. It's a first-degree felony. Why are you bringing me a Class B misdemeanor that is illegal to prosecute now when you could be investigating a first-degree felony for human trafficking of a child? And we've done a good job. We're coming along. More offices are taking that approach. I've seen a lot of progress even in the few years I've been doing this. But it is a paradigm shift to view vice work or sex work out there as a industry that the people you're encountering the most are going to be the victims, and you need to peel back those layers. And the only way to do that is to build trust, to refer them to services, and then for us to not. We also have a hard time because we might have someone come in through RICAU who's a victim, and they may not want to participate in the prosecution right off the bat because it's a very traumatic process, and they've just been through a lot of trauma. So we have to say, okay, take your time, get back on your feet, and if you're ready to talk to us, talk to us. So that's what the victim-centered approach is. And we've found, in the few years we've been doing this, a lot more success in building trafficking cases when you do treat victims as victims.
Can I just say something? This is a great question, Mr. Chris, because the risk factors are there. We have pretty good evidence on what they are, but part of the problem is not everybody fits into that box. But the other issue is that victims don't think they're victims. So, I don't go up to a patient and go, do you think you're a victim of domestic violence? And they're like, no, and they've got a broken arm, by their partner. So what we've learned is one of the best things I like to teach my residents and medical students about trauma is we are learning more and more about the neurobiology of trauma. And Dr. Bruce Perry, who's a psychiatrist, has said that your brain organizes to reflect your environment. So when you think of it like that, you're in a situation that is terrifying and controlling. Eventually, your brain is like, okay, this is how I stay alive. I'm not talking to that police officer. I'm not talking to the doctor who asked me a question if this was something, that I didn't want to do. Because why? Because the brain says if you open your mouth, you're going to get it, So it's a survival mechanism, and that is why understanding that neurobiology of trauma and the trauma bonding and where people are coming from, we need to take a step back and understand those answers to our questions, which we don't think are correct. And the second thing that I have to really give to the Secure Strike Force and A.G. Reyes' office is they are not only victim-centered, but you guys are trauma-informed. And this is something that's moving through medicine. It's been there in the mental health field for a long time, but we're trying to expand it to medicine in general. And trauma-informed is saying, I recognize trauma, I see trauma, I don't blame a victim. And that's exactly what the law enforcement group here in Utah is doing. And they're not saying, we're going to help you if you help us. They say, we're going to help you. And then, if you want to help us, that's fine. If you don't, that's fine too. But it's all about you and about the victim. And I think that when I heard that, when Leo Lucy was giving a talk when they got their grant, I was just like, wow, these people are doing trauma-informed care, and I don't think they even know it.
The protection and the salvation, of the victim is the end. It's not a means to an end, right? It's the highest and best good. Absolutely. Absolutely. Josh, if you want to chime in, I've got a couple of other just thoughts to throw out. Want to pay tribute to a lot of legislative partners. Dan mentioned one, Representative Romero. There have been a lot of them who have helped us. Because we don't have the laws in place to either prosecute or protect victims, very difficult for us to do our job. So anybody listening from other states, please make sure that you enlist those stakeholders up front, because it's critical that they understand the issue and then that they approach it in a sensible way. Maybe you can talk a little bit too, Josh, about NCMEC. I don't know the exact numbers, but orders of magnitude more. Maybe 10 years ago, there were 10,000. I'm just throwing numbers out randomly, but to illustrate, 10,000 images. NCMEC, National Center for Missing Exploited Children, our partner that works with us closely. Now, it's like millions of these images that we collect when we do cases and prosecute, arrest and prosecute perps. So the internet has exploded this, the ability for people to be trafficked in their own home, to be forced to be subjects of pornography, to be live streamed in sex acts and sold. And that's just the internet. When you throw in the dark net, which is like, the dark net reminds me of that Men in Black movie, the original one with like Tommy Lee Jones and Will Smith, where Will Smith's like, why do we keep erasing everybody's memory about this? And Tommy Lee Jones like, these people don't want to know about what's actually going on. And when you talk about the Tor and the dark net, that's another whole realm that we probably don't have time to get deep into. But you just have to recognize that there are as many good things that are going on with technology. The perps are utilizing technology every day to try to further exploit people. So those are just some things that I had, that popped up as people were talking about. And don't know if you want to maybe touch on a couple of those.
Yeah, it's scary because of the technology's growing so fast. It's hard to even keep up with it. And it's almost a full-time job to research and stay up with the technology and the applications on cell phones and everything that criminals are exploiting. But there's certainly a number of apps on phones right now that are absolutely being used for production of child pornography, for transferring child pornography images amongst individuals, and for trafficking and sex trafficking children and adults. And we've definitely seen an uptick in that with the advances.
But we utilize some pretty cutting-edge technology to fight back. And Dan, can you tell just for a second, Seattle Against Slavery, that bot? Tell them what's going on.
So this is an interesting side of it that we've all been talking about, traffickers and victims. The third piece of this triangle is that, at least for commercial sex, is the demand side for this, right? So people out there who want to purchase sex, and it's hard. That's been a problem since time, that prostitution's the oldest profession or whatever, because there's a huge demand out there, and there always has been. There's people willing to pay for it. The thing that we could change, though, we're working to change, is there's not a lot of fear from these people that they'll be caught, right? And there's been interesting work done. Sean and I recently presentation about from Seattle Against Slavery, obviously working out of Seattle, where they've actually done workshops with offenders purchasers who've gone through a program or whatever. And I used to naively believe that if you told these people this person's not doing it voluntarily, they're trafficked, that they would think, oh, I'm so sorry, I never would buy sex again. Sadly, that's not true. It's a very low, like 5% of the people would have changed their opinions if they knew that. So most of these guys don't care about that. What they do care about is getting caught, right? And it doesn't have to be a huge penalty. You don't have to put them in prison for life, because even just having their reputation destroyed by the fact that they're out there purchasing sex is going to be a pretty scary consequence. So across the country, people are working to do more to increase that fear that you will be caught, and make it from when you're making a decision to go pay somebody from maybe a 1% chance that you'll be found and arrested to, maybe get it up to 50%. And that would have a huge impact, at least on the commercial sex side of human trafficking. So the bot that Sean's alluding to, there's a couple of groups doing this, but Seattle Against Slavery has a bot that goes out there. So a bot is an AI on the internet. It goes out there and looks for, it presents itself actually as a 14-year-old seller. Yeah, so it posts an advertisement, sex available on the different forums. People text it and we'll have conversations with them. And the guy who developed it told me it was like the easiest AI they've ever designed, because these conversations are so just, they only fit 2 or 3.
Predictable.
Yeah, it's all the same.
Disgusting.
Yeah, it's just, yes, how much time, which things they do. But the bot will communicate with them, and then it gets to the point where it says, by the way, I'm 14, is that a problem? And the person says, no. And then the bot says, thank you, this conversation is being reported to law enforcement. Human trafficking is a crime, and cites the statute. And they've said they followed up the accounts that have communicated with the bot and found that even without any follow-up from law enforcement, just that text message saying, we know you did and it's being reported, that those accounts stay inactive on these forums for up to 6 months, or for around 6 months on average, I think he said. So it does have a deterrent effect, even though there may not ever be a law enforcement follow-up. It can be hard to establish identity and things in those cases, but even just putting the fear into them. So we had conversations with Seattle Against Slavery about getting that off the ground here in Utah, and we're working on that. But this is kind of the innovative technology side of it that it's hard. I mean, I'm sure Josh, and I'll tell you as well, that human trafficking cases, to get them from your first report to a final conviction of the jury, it's very difficult. It takes years. They're the hardest cases I've ever worked. Josh, I know, feels similarly. So anything we can do to put a dent in the marketplace as well is going to have huge yield.
It's free. Anyone can download it, and it's not the law enforcement agency per se. These are average citizens that are like deploying these bots all around Seattle. So they're just helping to again create more heat and deterrence, and that's the demand side. Again, on the supply side, every cartel that's taken down by Fight the New Drug and Operation Underground Railroad, every domestic case that Josh and then Dan help prosecute sends a strong deterrent message that if you're going to try to do that stuff here in Utah or wherever it's going, you're going to have to think twice. Because the reality is, one of the reasons human trafficking has escalated exponentially is that there is so much reward and there's very little risk. In terms of if you're just doing a cold calculation as a criminal, look, there are whole agencies like the DEA focused on the war on drugs, and I'm not going to get into the policy of that. But there's no agencies dedicated just to human trafficking. It's not up to this point. Traffickers, they know. They can resell human beings, like Dan said. There's very little chance they get caught, and if they do, a lot of times they're not getting prosecuted. So amping up the risk both for the Johns and the traffickers is important. David, I saw you had your hand up, and I don't want to...
I was just going to say, maybe Dan wants to talk a little bit about the human trafficking conviction that they just obtained on Friday.
Oh yeah, is that public then? Let's do it.
Isn't that
Ty just left the room. I would credit Ty Christensen, also my co-counsel.
Can you bring him back,
but...
or is he eating, or?
Come on,
Ty. Do you want to talk about just for a second? Can you make an announcement?
About last Friday?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So last Friday we had a case, human trafficking case, and we negotiated an offer, a resolution with the defendant, and he agreed to plead guilty to 1 count of human trafficking, which is a 2nd-degree felony, and 3rd-degree attempted aggravated exploitation or prostitution.
Which is a sex offender.
Which is a sex offense.
So, yeah, right.
We had to kind of craft it because right now the way that the statute is put together, human trafficking alone is not a sex offense. Aggravated human trafficking and human trafficking of a child are both sex offenses, but human trafficking alone is not. And so we crafted this deal so that he would plead guilty to human trafficking, but also have to register as a sex offender when he does get out of prison.
So what did you do, Ty?
He prevented a woman from leaving a car, drove her from St. George up to Salt Lake, and during this time he He threatened her. He drove around for, in her words, 2 hours looking for a plot to bury her body after he killed her. He raped her, he sodomized her, he did a number of things and threatened her that she would have to work in commercial sex to earn money to pay back a debt that he claimed that she owed him. And all this time she was doing what she could just to stay alive and cope with what was going on.
So an average citizen would say, well, that sounds like a rape case, Ty. Why is that not just a traditional rape case, and why did you prosecute the way you did?
And you know, the victim felt the same way. She felt like it was a rape case, it was a kidnapping case. Why is he not pleading to those? Why is he pleading to human trafficking? Human trafficking occurred the moment that he recruited or solicited or transported her in an effort to engage in commercial sex for money, and he did so with force, fraud, or coercion. So the fact that he was threatening her, the fact that he was raping her, that he was hurting her and doing all these things in an effort to force her into commercial sex to earn him money, right there alone, that was human trafficking. We felt human trafficking was a great way to memorialize the heinous nature of his crimes and I guess get the resolution that we were looking for.
Yeah, it was. We did the prelim on that down in St. George like 6 months ago, and the judge kind of the same question. Well, it was, there's transporting. This is why the AG's involvement is really important. That's the case that started in St. George and ended up in Salt Lake City, and crimes happened at every stop along the way. And you have all these different jurisdictions involved investigating them, and so we were able to take it and make a statewide case out of it, and do the prelim in St. George, and then venue got transferred to Salt Lake. And but as Ty said, it involved rape and kidnapping, but also human trafficking. And that one actually is. I said, that some of these cases aren't what you think of when you think human trafficking. This one actually was. I mean, she really was in the back of a van being transported and sexually exploited.
It's like left and tortured with these threats.
Yeah, but even then, as Ty and I worked these cases up to trial, something very difficult. The only two people in that van were her and him, and so coming up to trial, that's an issue that we have to think of when we're. But luckily, we had great investigative work by the people on Josh's team. Defendant actually, we got to look at his cell phone and he consented to it, which was foolish. And there was a video in there that really helped us. And so kind of leading up to trial, we were able to put enough pieces together that he owned up to what he did, pled guilty, and is going to prison. So.
In some cases, though, we haven't charged under the human trafficking statute, right, Ty and Dan, because of the victim's fear of retribution and our concern for their safety. And so we've looked at other means, maybe other types of financial crimes that would still take down the enterprise but not re-victimize the victim. I do want to add David Carlson is their boss over there who runs the Justice Division, and next to him, Russell Smith, another very senior human trafficking prosecutor. Well, I say that with respect. Come on. And has done a lot in Nevada originally in their AG's office and brought that over to us here. These are some of my heroes. Ruthie Pedregon, who works in our office on the victim side. So sorry, I just started calling out my team and was really proud of their work. Other questions about for any of the? It's your chance, like an undercover agent, or prosecutor not as exciting. Victim services and an LEO, a law enforcement officer who was actually a survivor. It's quite amazing. No, nobody. Yes. Okay.
My name is Garcia Hernandez from KUER. I just wanted to know how. So I just moved to the state 3 months ago. So it
from where?
From Arizona.
Okay. So we're still Ruthie from. That's awesome.
So I wanted to know how prevalent is this issue here in Utah, and how do we compare to other states, either nearby or across the country?
RICA, you keep some data.
Sure. Yeah. So. There are states, of course, that have more trafficking than Utah, but Utah does have some unique factors that we see increased rates of trafficking. So some of those are that we're at a crossroads of two major highways. So the I-15 and the I-80 crossroads right here, and so if a victim is being transported, the likelihood that they might exist and try to perform those acts here in Salt Lake is higher. Also, we have a lot of remote areas, so those agricultural and ranching areas. So as far as labor trafficking, we do see with that a lot of remote areas an increase in that type of trafficking. And then additionally, we have a lot of resort business, like up in Park City and areas like that because of our ski industry. So those are some factors that make us unique. Since 2012, I think is the data that I have, to 2017, there were 573 cases that were reported through the national hotline from Utah. And then identified, I think, victims were close to that 500 mark as well, so about 465-ish. I don't have the numbers for this last year, which of course would then increase it even more. So we do, although some of the border states, when you think of like California and Texas, Arizona, they may have higher numbers. Utah just has those unique qualities that do increase our risk for having human trafficking.
I might add too that when you're talking about resorts, Utah also has some unique events that happen here. Things like Sundance, but also the Olympics. Although it doesn't happen frequently, those are types of events. And I want to be clear, because Sundance folks get really sensitive and understand, but it has nothing to do with Sundance itself. It's it's a treasure for our state. But whenever you have people traveling in internationally, some very affluent, there is an opportunity for trafficking to go on and be underreported. The Super Bowl and other big events like that are some of the largest individual trafficking events that happen. So those are some factors that I think are important to recognize. The only other thing that I would add, because I think Andrea laid it out well, some of Utah's unique, maybe cultural vulnerabilities is trust. One of the reasons why Utah is so vulnerable to white-collar fraud is that, by and large, we're a pretty trusting state, which is really good in a lot of ways. It makes it a better state to live and have a business and raise a family. But when you trust too much and you're not nosy enough, there's a tendency for us to become victims of Ponzi scams and schemes, or to allow trafficking to go on right underneath our noses. I can't remember the case, but a few years ago, we were talking to some, it was an apartment complex where a number of victims from another country, it might have been Asia, it might have been Mexico or Central America, I can't remember, but they had like 20 women in the corner apartment coming in at odd hours, and we had asked the neighbors, like, didn't you ever notice something sort of weird going on with your neighbors? And they were like, oh, do you mean the foreign exchange apartment? And we're like, what do you mean? Like, oh, we went and dropped off some cookies and welcomed them into the neighborhood, and they told us that they were part of this, English language program, and so we never really thought anything of it after that. So again, the trust factor in Utah sometimes makes us a little bit more vulnerable, but those numbers that are reported to Polaris and through the traffic, those are just the ones that are reported.
Yeah.
The vast majority, in my experience, go underreported, and so that's a good number just to give you a flavor of what's going on, but you have to think it's much bigger and broader,
yes.
Right?
And since we've mentioned Polaris a couple of times, I'd just like to add is that through the UTIP task force, we have partnered with Polaris and given them Utah resources so that there would be one main number to call for victims, and they didn't have to go to different shelter numbers and all this. And so it might behoove all of these, kind of an easy number, and it's one that people can generally remember, but it's 888-3737-888. And so that's something that we can even give to patients, because when you've got a situation like domestic violence, human trafficking, you can't give them a bunch of information to go home with. So sometimes just giving them a number that hopefully will be retained will be helpful. And as I said, that they have our Utah resources. They know what we want to be done when someone from Utah calls and who they need to contact. So it kind of helped us give a one number resource, because doctors don't want to mess around a lot. So if I just say, all you got to do is give them this number, oh, okay, I'll do that. And so that has made it hopefully something that we can get that message out.
Hey, they can also text, by the way.
Yeah, what is the text?
Be free 233-733. So you can just text that number 233-733. and it gets directed to the right people. They have kind of a clearinghouse for so text B3
Do you want to give the tip line?
for the AG's office. If I had it memorized,
It's 801
You do have it memorized?
3443.
That's everything.
And what's good, what the deal with that number is it's a recording. So a victim who calls it could get help, but a lot of times you can't call them back. But it's still, if you're like, for instance, if they've seen something that doesn't quite look right, that would be a good number to call, and then the officers will call you back. So.
I had a question for Susie. So having been through what you've been through, from the community all the way through prosecutors, judges, I don't know which of those aspects of the process you interacted with, but thinking back, are there ways that society kind of failed you, and are there things you could recommend to all of us that we could do better to have helped someone in your position?
Well, let's start with the officers. I think it was the officers all that helped me in that questioning room. They were very engaged. They wanted to know. Their body language was faced towards me. They just didn't know how to help. Like you guys know, there was a lack of resources, a lack of knowledge. They were just like, well, where do we go with this? Type thing. And obviously there's more details and events that happened with my story that I shared with them. But I think they just didn't really know how to process it all. There was just a little bit of lack of education. But they were there. They took my report. Now with the detectives, that's just a little bit of a different story. One of the detectives didn't see how I was human trafficked, so she how do I put this? She just didn't see it. At the end, if we want to get truthful, she made me feel like I did something wrong, and I was like, whoa. She made me call him, or she didn't make me, she asked me, hey, how would you feel about doing a phone call to him, seeing if he answers? I said, sure. I was in a point in my life where I wanted to see where things went. So I give him a call. Anyways, I ask him certain questions. I talk to him about certain things. Anyways, she comes back to me and says, how come you were so giggly with him? I'm like, excuse me? I'm like, that's how I was with him. So if I wanted to seem like it was me, that's how I needed to be. I was, 6 months pregnant, speaking to him. I was like, what? So the way she treated me towards the end of it made me feel very much like I wasn't a victim. I got off the phone with her. It was all through interviews or over the phone and emails. I got off the phone with her and I lost it. And so that's really hard too. I was 19. I wasn't a juvenile. So that's sort of in a way that's failed me. But I have really good friends and things we're trying to get the reports and see what further we can do. The part of the pimp situation is still active. That case is still active, which is awesome. I just didn't hear about it a lot. So I think when police officers are dealing with, and detectives are dealing with these victims, follow-ups and things, letting them know what's going on. Not giving them false hope, but just letting them know, hey, nothing's going on right now, but just wanted to see how you were doing, is awesome. Just letting them know what's going on, because they're in a stage where they're trying to get some sense of control, and letting them know what's going on with that is somewhat of a recovering process for them too. So that's been a way of I don't know if that answered your question.
Yes, that's fine.
But I've been in contact with some prosecutors and such that want to look at the case and see if there's anything there. And what's heartaching for me is that I know that there's he still has other women there, and those women actually love him. I didn't grow that love for him, but they love him, and he treats them like dirt, and it's sad to know that they're still in it. He's still making money off of these women, and there's pretty much nothing I can do but just wait. So, yeah.
And I actually just wanted to highlight something that Dan just did. So I was really acknowledging that Susie is an expert and asking her questions directly, because within human trafficking, I think that's also a really important piece, is our survivors are the experts in these areas. Involving survivors in panels, that's super important. Involving survivors within policy-making decisions, with development of support services, in how we inform this movement going forward. The survivors is just such a key part, and so I just wanted to highlight that. I thought that I'm so glad that we have included Susie as our expert, because she is the expert of our situation, of helping us to be more trauma-informed and victim-centered about how we go about this work. So,
Thanks, Andrew. This is one of the things that Laura does so well, is to focus on victim sort of governed, and appreciate how. Yes, Kim.
I have actually two questions. One is for law, one is medical. How aggressive are you being in mandating that there be training to spot human trafficking in Utah among law enforcement? Because I know there are still people who don't even want training coming in. I personally don't believe that should be a choice. I think it should be mandated, and you guys are the ones that can mandate that. And, but there are some people that will not even receive the training, and therefore that leaves all of those open-ended, cases that will never be treated as such, which includes how a victim is treated. And then, so I'm wondering how to move that. But also in medical, I work on a mental health unit, and they were interviewing a doctor, and I'm just striking up a conversation because it's very important to me that someone be trauma-informed, especially on a mental health unit.
And as a survivor.
They had literally never heard the word trauma-informed when I asked them, so are you trauma-informed? Thinking that's a given, they're on a freaking mental health unit. So what's that? I seriously, I about lost it. And I'm like, okay, well, this is what it is. And so medically, I also believe that should be mandated, part of training. If anyone comes out in the medical field on any level, nurses, doctors, psychiatrists, for heaven's sake, psychiatrists, how do we press that? How do we get that out there? So I'm a tech, for heaven's sakes, asking someone else if they're trauma-informed. They're like, are you? Yes, I am. Yes, I am trauma-informed, and let me tell you. And so those are two things that I think are just so critically important. For one, obviously the investigation, naming it, finding it, prosecuting, treating victims appropriately, treating perpetrators appropriately, then receiving them in the medical field, and then on to victim services. There's such a break in that system. Some people do it well and some people don't do it at all. So, there you go. How you can handle all that.
You want to?
I was going to let you go first.
You say you want to start. I'm happy to take that.
Go ahead, I'll follow up.
So, look, I believe that everybody that every law enforcement officer should also have some training, but I don't have the authority to mandate that for the entire. So the legislature can mandate certain things with regard to law enforcement licensing, organizations that govern licensing and the practice of certain things like law enforcement. They have a lot of influence in being able to mandate curriculum. But each individual law enforcement agency leader can, at least within their circle of influence, institute policies for training. And that's where we have really tried to enlist our colleagues, not as a mandate, but as appeal to their sense of decency and the urgency of the crisis. And we've had a lot of success. There have been, again, if I just did trainings that I was asked to do personally, that's all I would do, 24/7, 365 days a year, in Utah, in the United States, and national and internationally. Clearly, we have a lot of other issues that we're responsible for. So there's a desire for it. It's hard to mandate. We have worked with the entertainment and hospitality industry. And again, I mentioned these before, Truckers Against Trafficking. They're doing, and in certain states they passed mandatory requirements for all truckers to have certain education. So it can be done. Airline ambassadors, those who work in the airline industry, hotels and entertainment. I'm working with, I haven't made a lot of headway yet, but I'm meeting with some of the principals of the largest car rental agencies and companies in the United States. Same idea, because they ought to at least be able to recognize. But for law enforcement and the medical community that deals so closely with victims and survivors, I agree with what you're saying, that we should all be trained. But we here don't have the power to, at least with the stroke of a pen, make that a requirement for our colleagues.
Can I say who does have the power? The legislature, of course. But you can go top down that way. But the better way to do it would be to go bottom up, right? All police agencies are local. The biggest one in the area is Salt Lake County Unified Sheriff's Department. Even that's only countywide. These are responsive local government bodies. If you get enough people coming to them and saying, do you do human trafficking training? And they don't have an answer for that, they're going to do it. I'm the chair of the Rose Park Community Council in my other life, and I also do this job. And so I approached the mayor's office and said, does Salt Lake City have human trafficking training? And that was all it took. And then they called us later, and I guess I was double dealing there, but I went and did a training for them that way. And every one of your neighborhoods has a community council, at least if you're in Salt Lake City, where you can show up at their meeting or give them a call and push that message up, and it'll happen. But it takes a groundswell of public support on the issue for them to want to spend their resources that way, because they've got a million other things competing for their resources as well. And I'll also say with within our office, we catch more flies with honey or whatever. We are trying to build partnerships with these agencies and get them in train. We had our grant that funds Ty's work, who was in here a minute ago. We got that renewed for another 3 years, and part of our grant proposal there was to partner with county agencies, especially in the rural areas of Utah, and kind of fellowship them on human trafficking for a year, so that then they can go out and kind of take it from there. So we're working on it, but it kind of takes a partnership and a collaborative approach. We could, or potentially the legislature could pass something that mandated it, but I think in a way that's the harder path than just getting the agencies.
Well, I don't know anything about law. I'm just like, this is. Well, you guys are working so hard up here, but you're not getting support down here. So it's.
Well, we do have a lot of support at the local levels, but you just have to recognize this is such a relatively new phenomenon for most people.
I'm speaking too broadly, and so I whoever's doing it well.
No,
I've just not seen that myself.
There are a lot of agencies, but you still have not. Most of the media has been amazing to help elevate this discussion. But there's still some in the media, as recently as a couple of years ago, that were saying doesn't exist.
Yes.
It's just it's a fiction that law enforcement and politicians have made up to engender some sort of crisis and scare the people. And I'll be honest, when I started talking about this 5 years ago, and I was researching, a lot of political folks, including consultants, said, "Dude, that's a dead bang loser. Like, don't talk about that." Also, they said that about opioids and suicide. But we, in our office, at least, our approach is let's do the thing that we think is right, and we'll let the chips fall where they may in terms of politics and public perception. And interestingly now, 5 years later, all of those subjects have now garnered a lot of interesting political attention, and so they're getting more popular, which is fine. Whenever we get an Ashton Kutcher to talk about it, or somebody of that, who can, if I have I've done congressional hearings, probably 5 people watched the YouTube or CNN report on that, including my family. Ashton Kutcher got up and he sneezed before his testimony, and I think there were 10 million likes immediately. So we are trying to enlist everyone around. but mandating things is a little difficult in any arena. But I like the enthusiasm.
Can I just say something about healthcare?
Yes,
Because, I learned early on, I've done domestic violence for 2 decades now, and it was always hard to bring that into the healthcare realm because physicians didn't think it was they didn't think it was their issue, right? We know domestic violence affects your health. But what I've learned over the years is I start with my young people, because when I came here with a curriculum to teach residents about domestic violence, one of the docs in the clinic said to me, older doc, said, I'm going to tell you what, Kathy, I'm never asking a mother if she's a victim of domestic violence. And I said, I don't care if you do, but your residents are, because I'm going to train them. So what are you going to do with that? And he goes, I'm going to call you. I said, okay, as long as you have a plan. So I know it's my young people. This next generation, we see more and more training on abuse. We see more and more on all forms of abuse, on trauma-informed care. So be gentle with the older docs. They didn't get this training. But give us a generation, and I think that we will see a change. And I see this, in all levels. So we do the best we can.
I saw Shu had his hand up, the amazing director there. So Rick, sorry to preempt you. I think Rick might have been telling us our time was running.
I was going to say one more question.
Oh,
Sounds
well,
like-
Rick, you want to let you
first
know
of
that he
all,
has time for one more question?
I would like to have a copy of his jacket. It was really cool.
Yeah, me too.
Absolutely. We can make sure
in the
that.
national training on trafficking, there are 2 risk factors that has not been mentioned here. One is being homeless.
Yes.
Young people, for whatever reason, having conflict at home, running away. That's one. The other one is being among the LGBT community. Those are 2 risk factors that people really didn't associate that with trafficking.
No, thank you for raising that. Those, and there are lots of others too. We mentioned a few of them earlier. Any type of somebody who's been abused or part of a cycle of abuse at any point is exponentially, again, more vulnerable to be exploited yet again. LGBTQ community has, I don't have the specifics, and maybe you have some stats, but yeah, highly elevated, above the norm, and any group that is persecuted or potentially on the margins of what society will push them out towards is highly susceptible. And I'm glad you brought that up, Shu. This is another hero who's been doing this for decades. When I was like a brand new lawyer, he hasn't changed at all. He's still as young as ever. I don't know, that was in the mid-90s. Shu was a great partner and has continued to do the work of angels. I know you guys had some comments, so I'll let you.
I just have one more thing to say. I think a lot of times when we come in contact with these females, males, kids, sometimes we think they're just a big chore to fix up, and such. Had I not had a beautiful mother to guide me and pick out doctors who specialize in trauma and know how to speak to me after my situation occurred, and my care treatment wasn't organized or wasn't given to me by a director or anything like that. I had to figure it out by myself. But it's awesome that these resources are available, and it's very, very effective if we utilize them and feed into them. But something I just want to reiterate is when you come into contact with these people, don't just think of them as, a crack whore or a prostitute or some kid that has, they're just messed up or have issues or anything like that. I've heard it from several people. Those people are just trash or they're low lives, things like that. Had someone said that to me, I wouldn't be where I am today. Had I not had friends and family that believed in me and seen the potential that I had, I wouldn't have been able to raise my baby boy. I probably would have gone back to my pimp and kept the cycle going with my baby. So please, when you come into contact, do not treat these people like they're trash or like they're a crack whore or, etc. But treat them with, dignity and kindness and give them hope and speak to them like you would any other person, even though they're not mentally there, even though they talk to you poorly. Please just have that thought that, this person could be the President of the United States. Because had you seen me 3 years ago, pregnant and all, you probably wouldn't have thought I would become a police officer and sit here and speak to you guys today about being a survivor of human trafficking. But miracles do happen, and people can conquer amazing things. So please keep that in mind.
Can we clap for each Any final comments from our panelists on anything that we talked about? Susie's story also reminded me, Kathy, maybe you can mention Laura's work talked about the number of forced abortions on average for each of these survivors, and it was staggering again too.
I was going to mention that and I forgot it, because one of the things that when you're getting a medical history, and they say even if I tell my residents and medical students, even if a mother says or a woman says, I've had several miscarriages, right? Those are spontaneous abortions. I said, the rate of spontaneous abortions was very high in this group of women who were survivors of sex trafficking, as well as induced. And so I said, don't just go, oh, spontaneous, that means it just happened. I said, what you should do is say to them, well, what were the circumstances around the time that you lost that baby? Can you talk to me about that? Because, you get kicked in the stomach, you might have a miscarriage, but it was really because there was trauma. So, we can't just take that medical history and not kind of step back and go, wow, you've had 3 miscarriages? Maybe we need to do a workup. Or should the question be, what happened around that time? So that's a very, very good point. And the other thing that was quite shocking was, in her report, was GI complaints. Many were malnourished in this country, and even in our state. We don't see, people, adults especially, who are so cachectic and wasted because they're malnourished, right? And then the other thing was dental, believe it or not. The dental hygiene was atrocious, and many people had dental issues, not only from not being able to care for themselves, but also from the trauma, around their jaw and face that was happening to them. So things we see, every day in the clinic are clues to move forward and ask the right questions.
One of the stories she shared, and I don't know I can't remember the name of the medicine, the morning after.
Yes.
This one young lady had said for 4 or 5 years she was forced to take that like multiple times every day just to try to preclude and the effects, the after effects are, that's clearly the human body wasn't intended to ingest that kind of a chemical over and over and over and over again. And right now she's dealing with so many ancillary sort of problems as a result of that. Anyway,
Thank you.
Josh, again, you're one of the more loquacious members of our law enforcement team, so I want to give you the chance to, any thoughts or perspectives or things that you want the average person to know about human trafficking?
I think we've touched on everything here, just that we can all keep our eyes and ears to the ground and kind of notice what's going on in the community a little more, pry into pry into what we see going around us a little more than we typically do. And I think if we pay more attention, we'll see more of this going on.
What percentage of our cases, Josh, came from citizen tips or workers' tips? Pretty large, right?
Yep, most of our really good cases come from informants and come from just tips on out there in the community. They're not coming in through the hotline. As we discussed, this is a hidden crime that you really have to go out and find these cases, and they're there happening. I'm sure there's multiple cases like this happening right now that we're unaware of. So the challenge is to go find those.
If we had 20 more agents, we could keep them busy just investigating human trafficking cases. That's the sad reality, but we'll take the resources that we can. how comfortable do you feel with guys like Kalis out there staking out people in the middle of the night? Do you mind if we give him a round of applause representing all of us? Really brave. And then a round of applause for Dr. Frenchick, who Andrea, going to give you a last word too, if you have any things to say.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. So I think the last thing is when we go out and give presentations and have outreach activities like this, I think it's really important to have some action items as well. And so just some of those action items have already really been mentioned. We have survivor experts who are asking for kindness and to see people as a whole, and I think that's really powerful. That was a powerful message. We talked a little bit about kind of supporting or putting pressure on those areas in which we have influence. So if we are part of specific networks for police departments or for community groups or for neighborhood community groups, things like that, that we can then encourage them to seek out training and to recognize these signs. There's also the support of the legislature. So as different legislators are going to put forth different legislative, I don't know all those words, but as they go forward to put that, we can support those candidates with our votes. We can support them in all of those ways. We also can both financially support and with your time through volunteer work with a lot of the victim service agencies. So there's lots of different ways that community members actually can take steps. So learning the signs and red flags and things is an important step. But there's all these other things we can do within our own personal realms to support the cause. And so those are just a smattering of a few things we can do. But there are action items that we can take in our everyday lives that can move this movement forward. So,
how about a round of applause for RIC, Andrea, Shu, and the whole team. And we've got the hot tip, the tip line out. One other quick action item. Just take a minute a day to look online for a case or report of human trafficking going on. You'll be surprised and shocked how many are actually going on. I have a friend, Jerome Elam, who's one of the world's foremost experts in fighting human trafficking, who sends me about 20 to 50 links a day, which I love, but they're a lot. So you don't have to do that to your friends, but if you find one or two, why not send those around, post them on social media, get people acclimated. Dan, you do have your final word.
I just continue with my message that the people have the power here. The most important action item I could recommend is to have a conversation with the people you know about what you heard today. I mean, we hopefully got a few people to listen today and hopefully taught you something, but at every level of this work, it depends on an informed populace to recognize the crime, and then once it gets to police, for the police officers to understand what that is, and then once it goes to court, for the judges and even defense attorneys to have a better picture of this crime. We're going to get more convictions, and really our only chance of stopping this permanently is for everyone to be educated. So the most important thing you can do is just spread the word, and hopefully we can kind of move society from that pop culture image that has been helpful in conveying the seriousness of this crime and what it feels like to people to be in prison, to maybe a more robust understanding of what it looks like out in the community, so that we're not limited to just that picture that we see from those types of images.
Thanks, Dan. I know there are lots of lawyer jokes, but how about a round of applause for our prosecutors and the security staff? These guys off the streets. Final thought and comment. This is a dark and very heavy burden that we're just laid on you. This is a dark subject to talk about, but I, in all of that darkness, see a lot of hope, and that hope is that if we work together and we're truly united, that there's light that we can all bring. Each of you radiates a certain light and can influence people, those who are victims, to lift them out of that darkness, and those who are potential observers, eyes and ears, to help educate them. And so if there is one silver lining in all this darkness, it's that this is not a partisan issue. It's not a Democrat or Republican or any other. It's a humanitarian issue. We're all human beings from the same human family. And if we will come together and truly work together, there's nothing that we can't do. And one day, my hope is that we will be able to eradicate, if not entirely, largely, human trafficking in all of its forms, whether that be sex exploitation, labor trafficking, organ harvesting, conscriptions, the illegal transfer of, unauthorized transfer of children, all of these things that we're talking about today. But the key is you and us working together. So with that thought, thank you for being here, and we look forward to seeing you at another one of these events soon. Have a great day. God bless you.